That afternoon still lingers in my mind. Cooper, a 67-year-old retired carpenter, walked into my clinic with a hesitant smile. His hands, once steady from years of crafting wood, trembled ever so slightly as he tried to button his shirt. His wife, Mary, held his arm tightly, her eyes filled with quiet worry. "Doctor," she said softly, "yesterday he forgot the way home. He walked past our street 3 times, and when I asked him where he was going, he couldn't answer." I saw the confusion in Cooper's face, not just the kind that comes from forgetting a name, but the deeper fog that unsettles both the one experiencing it and the loved ones who watch helplessly. I've sat across from many men like Cooper, proud, hard-working souls who never thought that memory could betray them. They would shrug off the little lapses at first, forgetting where they put their keys, mixing up dates, or asking the same question twice. But as the years rolled by, the lapses grew heavier. For Cooper, it was that moment on his own street that shook him awake. A place he had walked for 40 years suddenly felt foreign. He told me he felt as if a part of himself had slipped away, leaving only silence where certainty once lived. As I listened, I thought back to my own father, who had walked this same path years before. I remembered the nights my family sat at the table, whispering about his forgetfulness, each of us afraid to say the word dementia out loud. It is a word that carries fear, but also one that reminds us of the fragile gift of memory. I knew that if Cooper and Mary were sitting in front of me, they were ready not just for answers, but for hope, something to hold on to when the days felt darker than the nights. So I leaned in, speaking to them the way I would speak to my own family. I told them that while the past cannot be undone, the future is not yet written. The brain, even in its aging years, is not a closed book. There are ways to nurture it, to calm the storms of inflammation, to clear the clouds of confusion. No miracle cure, no magic pill, but gentle, daily choices that could give Cooper a fighting chance. Sometimes it is as simple as what we place on our plates, the smells and flavors that season not only our food, but also our lives. Mary's eyes widened when I mentioned spices. Ordinary things from the kitchen, she thought. Cinnamon, turmeric, rosemary, things she used without giving them a second thought. Yet these simple flavors, I explained, carry compounds that protect the brain, like quiet guardians working in the background. I could see her shift from fear to curiosity, her hand resting on Cooper's with a little more hope than before. Cooper, too, smiled faintly, as if the thought of his favorite dishes being part of his healing journey lifted a weight off his chest. That day was the beginning of their transformation, not in some dramatic overnight cure, but in the steady rhythm of daily living. A sprinkle of spice here, a mindful walk there, and the choice to greet each morning not with dread, but with intention. Cooper left my clinic not cured, but changed, because he understood that memory is not only about what we recall, but about how we choose to live each day. And that is the story I want to share with you now, so you too may see how the smallest choices can light the way in even the foggiest of moments. The morning light filtered through the curtains in Cooper's small home, but instead of its usual warmth, it carried with it a sense of unease. Mary stood by the kitchen counter, watching her husband stare blankly at the teapot. For years, his mornings had been the same. Tea at 6, toast at 6:30, a walk to the garden just before 7. That rhythm was as steady as the clock ticking on the wall. But that morning, Cooper didn't seem to know what to do next. He lifted the kettle, set it down, and then looked at Mary as if asking silently what step came after. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, trying not to alarm him. He smiled faintly, but his eyes betrayed the truth. "Just a bit foggy," he murmured, rubbing his temple. But inside, Mary felt a tremor of fear. This wasn't the first time. The night before, he had left the lights on in every room, and when she gently pointed it out, he had laughed it off as forgetfulness. Yet she knew her husband. Cooper was a man who built furniture with his bare hands, measuring each piece with precision. Forgetfulness was not in his nature. Something deeper was taking place. When they came to see me in the clinic, I didn't greet them with charts and lectures. I listened. Cooper described the fog, the moments when the world seemed just out of reach, as though his memory had stepped into another room without telling him. Mary described her quiet worry, how she had begun following him when he went to the market, afraid he might lose his way again. These were not just symptoms on a page. They were the beginning of a story many families know too well, and yet each family feels like it is the first to walk through it. I told them what I tell everyone who sits across from me. Memory is fragile, but it is not helpless. The brain is a living organ, constantly influenced by the smallest things we do each day. One of the simplest yet most powerful truths I shared with Cooper was about turmeric, a spice tucked away in so many kitchens, often forgotten like the memories he struggled to hold on to. I explained gently that turmeric carries curcumin, a compound known to reduce inflammation, the silent spark that often worsens memory decline. Mary's eyes softened as if this small golden powder might hold a piece of the hope she had been searching for. Cooper chuckled, remembering how his grandmother used to stir turmeric into warm milk whenever he caught a cold. He hadn't thought much of it then, but now it was as if the past had delivered him a quiet gift. The idea that something familiar, something within reach, could help light the dimming corners of his mind gave him a sense of agency he hadn't felt in months. That evening, back at home, Mary placed a small pot on the stove. She added milk, a touch of honey, and a spoonful of turmeric, stirring slowly. When she handed the cup to Cooper, his hands trembled, but not from fear, from anticipation. He took a sip, the earthy flavor settling on his tongue, the warmth spreading through his chest. It wasn't just a drink, it was a promise, a ritual that could anchor him each night, a step toward healing. For Cooper, that was the first transformation. It wasn't about curing memory loss overnight. It was about reclaiming a sense of control, about replacing helplessness with intention. A simple cup of turmeric milk became the first brick in rebuilding the wall that memory had begun to erode. He told me later that he felt lighter, not because his memory suddenly returned, but because he believed there was still something he could do, a choice he could make each day to fight for himself. And that belief, more than anything, was the spark that carried him forward into the journey that awaited him. The following week, Mary convinced Cooper to join her on their old morning walk. For years, the two of them had strolled down the lane, past the row of maple trees, toward the small park where children's laughter filled the air. But this time was different. Cooper walked slower, his eyes darting as if the streets were unfamiliar. When they reached the corner, he stopped and looked around, unsure which way to turn. Mary tightened her grip on his hand. "It's this way, love," she whispered, guiding him gently. Cooper's pride stung, but he nodded, his silence saying more than words could. That day, when they returned home, he sat in the living room with a heaviness she hadn't seen before. "Mary," he admitted, "I feel like I'm losing myself. If I can't remember the way, what else will I forget?" His voice cracked, and for the first time she saw tears well in his eyes. For a man who had built a life with his hands, who had raised a family and fixed every broken chair and window in the house, the idea of losing his own mind felt like the cruelest fate. When they told me about this moment in my office, I leaned forward, choosing my words with care. "Cooper," I said, "memory is not just about the mind, it's about the body too. The more you move, the more your brain remembers how to find its way." He looked puzzled at first, so I explained in the simplest way I knew. Movement increases blood flow, and blood flow carries oxygen and nutrients that keep the brain alive. Without it, the fog only thickens. It wasn't about running marathons or lifting weights. It was about walking every single day, even when the streets felt uncertain. Mary smiled softly, remembering the man who once walked miles to deliver handmade chairs to neighbors. She turned to him and said, "Let's make walking our medicine." Cooper laughed faintly. "Medicine I can live with," he replied. That very evening, they tied their shoes and stepped outside again, this time not as husband and wife going for a stroll, but as partners on a mission to keep his memory alive. At first, the walks were slow, measured, with Mary pointing out landmarks to help him reconnect. "Here's Mrs. Harris's garden," she would say. "Remember when you fixed her fence?" Slowly, familiarity returned, and with it, a sense of confidence. Cooper began to walk taller, his steps steadier. The fog was still there, but the rhythm of walking gave him something to hold on to. A week later, he came back into my office with a glimmer in his eye. "Doctor," he said, "I think the streets are coming back to me." He wasn't cured, and we all knew that. But the act of walking had given him more than just physical strength. It had given him dignity. The knowledge that his body could still serve his mind reminded him that he was not powerless in this fight. That was the second transformation. Cooper realized that memory is not just an abstract thing floating in the mind. It is tied to the body, to the rhythm of steps, to the flow of blood. Each walk was no longer just an exercise. It was a statement that he was still here, still himself, still moving forward even through the fog. It was a Sunday evening when the family gathered around the dining table. Their daughter, Emily, had come over with her 2 children, and the house was filled with the sound of chatter and clinking plates. Cooper loved these evenings. They reminded him of the years when laughter echoed through the halls as his children grew. But that night, as he reached across to pass the bread, he paused mid-sentence. He looked at his granddaughter, the little girl with curly brown hair, and for a few long seconds, the name would not come. Mary noticed immediately, leaning in with a gentle smile. "Her name's Lily, remember?" she whispered. Cooper laughed awkwardly, but inside, shame burned. Lily giggled, not realizing the weight of the moment, but Cooper felt it like a stone in his chest. To forget a street was one thing. To forget the name of his own grandchild, that was something he feared most of all. When they shared this with me, I could see the raw pain in his eyes. "Doctor," he said, "I don't want my grandchildren to remember me as the man who forgot them." His words broke the silence in the room. I took a breath and reminded him of something important. The brain, like the body, needs nourishment to keep its connections alive. The food we eat, I explained softly, can either dull or sharpen the mind. Some foods fan the flames of forgetfulness, while others help calm them. I told him about rosemary, a simple herb often sprinkled on roasted potatoes or chicken. Scientists have long noticed its compounds, carnosic acid in particular, that help protect the brain from oxidative stress, one of the quiet thieves of memory. I didn't explain this with medical terms. Instead, I shared the story of how in old traditions, rosemary was a symbol of remembrance, often placed in the hands of loved ones during ceremonies. Even our ancestors, I said gently, knew this herb carried memory within it. That evening, Mary decided to try something new. She roasted a chicken with rosemary and garlic, filling the house with a fragrance that carried both comfort and hope. As the family gathered again the next week, the meal was served with quiet intention. When Lily ran into the kitchen calling, "Grandpa, look!" Cooper bent down and whispered her name with clarity. He looked up at Mary, eyes glistening as though that one remembered name was a victory against the shadows pressing in on him. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Cooper began to see meals not as routine, but as moments of care for his mind. Each bite seasoned with rosemary became a small promise that he would fight to remember the faces he loved most. Emily, his daughter, later told me, "Dad seems lighter at the table, as if he's not just eating, but reclaiming himself." This was the third transformation. Food was no longer just about feeding the body. For Cooper, it became a bridge, a way to tie memories to flavors, to let the scent of rosemary carry him back to the names and faces that mattered most. In those moments, he realized that remembering wasn't only about what the brain could hold, but about what the heart refused to let go. The nights were often the hardest. Mary would wake to find Cooper sitting at the edge of the bed, his shoulders hunched, staring into the dark as if searching for something he had lost. Sleep had become a stranger to him. He would drift for an hour, then wake with his mind unsettled, restless, unable to quiet the thoughts that slipped in and out like shadows. Mary reached for his hand one night and asked gently, "What keeps you awake?" Cooper sighed, his voice weary. "I'm afraid, Mary, afraid that when I wake up, another piece of me will be gone." The exhaustion was taking its toll. During the day, he was more forgetful, more irritable, as though the lack of rest had pulled him further from himself. When they came to me, Mary looked worn, her eyes tired from long nights of worry. I nodded, for I had seen this before. "Cooper," I said softly, "the brain heals in the night. When you sleep, it clears away the waste, the proteins that cloud memory. Without rest, the fog only thickens." I told them about lavender, not in the language of science, but in the way a grandparent might share an old family remedy. For centuries, I explained, people have placed lavender by their pillows. Its fragrance doesn't just soothe the senses, it calms the heart, quiets the mind, and invites sleep to return. Mary's face softened. She remembered her own mother placing dried lavender in small sachets around the house, the scent a gentle reminder of peace. That night, Mary prepared a simple ritual. She brewed a light lavender tea and placed a few drops of lavender oil near their bedside. The room filled with a fragrance both familiar and comforting. Cooper lay back, hesitant at first, but as the minutes passed, his breaths grew deeper, his body less tense. Mary stayed awake longer, watching him drift into a steadier sleep than he had known in weeks. She whispered into the quiet, "Rest, my love. Let your mind find its way home." In the days that followed, the difference was clear. Cooper was calmer, less easily shaken. He still forgot things, but the sharp edges of his fear seemed softened. With rest, his mind was given a chance to mend, even if only slightly. One morning over breakfast, he smiled at Mary and said, "I slept through the night." It was a small triumph, but one that brought tears to her eyes. This was his fourth transformation. He began to understand that memory was not just about what he did in the daylight, but also about what he allowed in the quiet of night. The gift of sleep was more than rest. It was a kind of cleansing, a reset that gave him strength to face each new day. And for Mary, seeing him sleep peacefully was a reminder that even in the battle with forgetting, there could still be moments of peace, of reprieve, of hope. One Sunday afternoon, the family gathered once more in the garden. The sun was warm, the children were chasing one another through the grass, and Mary had set out tea with slices of bread and jam. It should have been a simple, joyful day. But as Emily asked Cooper a question about his childhood, his voice faltered. He searched for the words, opening his mouth only to close it again. Finally, he shook his head, whispering, "I can't find it." The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. For a man who had built his life on stories, tales of carpentry, of raising a family, of summers by the lake, to lose his words felt like losing his very identity. That evening, he sat alone on the porch, his hands folded tightly as if gripping something that might slip away. When he spoke to me about it, there was a tremor in his voice. "Doctor," he said, "when I can't tell my story, who am I?" His fear was not just about forgetting others, but about being forgotten himself. I reminded him gently that the brain, like a fire, sometimes needs a spark. Certain foods carry compounds that help keep those sparks alive. One of those was sage, a humble herb, but one long associated with clarity and speech. I told him how its oils could help the brain's chemical messengers, supporting memory and language. Not in grand, scientific terms, but in the way his grandmother might have said, "Sage sharpens the tongue and clears the mind." Mary listened with intent, and that week she began weaving sage into their meals. She sprinkled it over roasted vegetables, stirred it into soups, and even brewed a light sage tea in the evenings. At first, Cooper barely noticed, but slowly, small moments began to change. One morning when Lily handed him a drawing, he said without pause, "That's beautiful, Lily." The name rolled off his tongue naturally, without hesitation. Later, as Emily asked about his carpentry days, he began, haltingly, to recall the smell of cedar wood, the feel of sawdust in his palms. His words were not as fluid as before, but they were his again. The family noticed. Emily smiled through tears, telling me later, "Dad's voice sounds more like him. It's as if the stories are still inside, waiting for their chance to come out." Cooper, too, felt the shift. "It's not perfect," he admitted, "but when I find the words, it feels like I've found myself again." This was his fifth transformation. It was not just about speech, but about reclaiming identity. Each leaf of sage was more than an herb. It was a bridge back to the voice he thought he had lost. For Cooper, speaking again, even in fragments, was a reminder that he was still here, still Cooper, still the man with stories worth telling. Winter came softly that year, laying a thin veil of frost over the small town. Cooper sat by the window one morning, watching the white breath of the world outside. His hands, folded on his lap, were steadier now, not from a cure, but from a rhythm he and Mary had built together. The turmeric at night, the walks each morning, the rosemary at dinner, the lavender for sleep, and the sage to help him find his words. These had become rituals, woven into the fabric of their days. They were no longer simply remedies, they were threads of hope. One evening, Emily brought over an old family photo album. She placed it on the table, the cover worn with years of use. Cooper hesitated, his fingers trembling as he turned the pages. Faces smiled back at him from another time, weddings, birthdays, quiet afternoons in the garden. He frowned at first, uncertain, but then, with a spark in his eyes, he pointed to one photo. "That's when we built the treehouse," he said softly, his voice carrying both pride and wonder. Mary looked at him with tears brimming, whispering, "Yes, love, you remember." In that moment, it was clear. Memory wasn't measured by how much he forgot, but by what he could still hold on to. It wasn't perfection, but presence. Even when the fog returned, and it did, on some days more heavily than others, he and Mary had learned not to drown in it. Instead, they reached for the small anchors they had discovered together: a walk, a spice, a story, a night of rest. Each one a gentle reminder that life was still worth holding on to. When Cooper spoke to me during his last visit of that year, his words carried a new kind of strength. "Doctor," he said, "I may not win against time, but I can walk with it, day by day." His voice was steady, not defiant, but full of quiet acceptance. Mary squeezed his hand and added, "And we'll walk with it together." This was his sixth and final transformation. It was not about finding a cure, nor about erasing the illness. It was about discovering dignity in the face of decline, hope in the midst of uncertainty, and love that grew stronger even as memory faltered. The truth Cooper carried was simple. The smallest choices can create the brightest lights, even when tomorrow feels uncertain. And that is where his story leaves us, not with despair, but with a reminder. For every Cooper, for every Mary, for every family facing the fog of memory loss, there are still paths to walk, flavors to taste, and moments to treasure. Sometimes the fight is not about changing fate, but about choosing how to live within it. As I look back on Cooper's journey, I often think of how quietly it began. A lost street, a forgotten name, a sleepless night. What felt at first like small cracks in the wall soon revealed how fragile memory can be. Yet through every fear, every stumble, Cooper discovered something many of us forget: the power of small choices, not pills or promises of miracles, but the steady rhythm of daily acts that spoke louder than despair. I share his story not just because it is his, but because it may be yours too. Perhaps you've noticed your hands trembling as you search for the right word, or maybe you've watched a loved one pause, trying to remember a familiar face. These moments can feel terrifying, like the future is slipping through your fingers. But Cooper's path reminds us that even when the fog of forgetting arrives, there are still lights we can kindle along the way. The truth is simple: spices on the table, walks in the morning, restful nights, laughter around dinner, they all become more than routines. They are the threads that keep us stitched to ourselves and to the people we love. Cooper didn't find a cure. What he found was dignity, courage, and presence. And perhaps that is the greatest victory anyone can ask for. So tonight, when you sit down for a meal, sprinkle a little rosemary, stir in some turmeric, or let the scent of lavender soften the air. These are not just ingredients. They are gentle companions on the road ahead. And as you take those small steps, remember Cooper's words: "I may not win against time, but I can walk with it, day by day." To every family listening now, hold one another close. Share the stories while you can. Make the small choices that matter. For memory is not only what we keep in our minds, it is what we live in our hearts. And as long as we live with love, no part of us is ever truly lost. The seasons passed, and with each one, Cooper and Mary continued their quiet rituals. What began as desperate attempts to hold back the fog of memory had transformed into a way of living, a rhythm of love and intention woven into each day. The turmeric at dusk, the lavender at night, the rosemary at the dinner table, the sage in his tea, and the walks through their little town. All of it became part of their story, not as a cure, but as a legacy. One spring afternoon, as Cooper sat in the garden, Lily climbed onto his lap with her drawing book. "Grandpa," she asked, "can you tell me a story?" For a moment, Cooper hesitated, as he often did. But then his eyes softened and he began to speak of the time he built a treehouse for Emily, her mother. The words came slowly, but they came, each one carrying the weight of love more than the burden of memory. Lily listened, wide-eyed, and Mary watched from the porch, her heart swelling with quiet gratitude. Later that evening, Cooper turned to Mary and whispered, "I may not remember everything, but I still remember us." That was the truth that mattered most, not the lost streets or the forgotten names, but the presence of love that outlasted the gaps in memory. And so, Cooper's story is not just about loss, but about resilience, about how the smallest choices, a spice, a walk, a night of rest, can shape not only the mind, but the heart. It reminds us that even when the future feels uncertain, we still hold power in how we face each day. If you are listening now, perhaps you too are walking this path, or guiding someone you love along it. Let Cooper's journey be a gentle reminder. You do not need perfection to live fully. You only need presence, love, and the courage to keep choosing hope. For in the end, memory is not only about what we keep, it is about what we give, what we share, and how we love, and that, above all else, never fades. As I close Cooper's story, I want you to remember this. Aging is not a defeat, and memory loss is not the end of the road. It is a path, one filled with shadows, yes, but also with light, with choices, and with love that does not forget. Cooper showed us that even when the mind falters, the heart can still guide the way. His journey was not about erasing the illness, but about discovering meaning inside it. Perhaps you are walking a similar road, or perhaps you fear the day when memory begins to fade. If that day comes, I hope you will recall Cooper and Mary sitting together in their kitchen, sprinkling rosemary on a meal, stirring turmeric into warm milk, or walking hand in hand down a familiar street. These simple acts are not cures, but they are acts of love, and love itself is the strongest memory we can leave behind. So tonight, when you see the faces around your table, hold them close. Tell the stories, even if the words come slowly. Laugh at the little things. Cherish the ordinary moments, because these are the treasures that time cannot steal. Cooper's voice still echoes in my heart. I may not win against time, but I can walk with it day by day. And if we can all do the same, if we can walk with time instead of fearing it, then no memory is ever truly lost. If you've stayed with me through Cooper's story, perhaps you've seen a reflection of your own life or of someone you love. These moments, the forgotten names, the sleepless nights, the quiet rituals at the kitchen table, are not just Cooper's. They belong to countless families walking bravely through the same fog. I want you to remember this. You are not powerless. Each day brings small choices, the food you prepare, the steps you take, the laughter you share, the rest you allow yourself. These choices may seem ordinary, but together they build strength, dignity, and connection. They are the anchors that hold us steady, even when memory begins to drift. So as you leave this story, I invite you to take one small step today. Brew a calming tea, go for a gentle walk, sprinkle a healing spice into your meal, or simply sit beside someone you love and listen to their story. These are the things that matter most. Cooper's journey reminds us that memory is not measured only by what the mind retains, but by how the heart continues to give. And if we live each day with presence and love, then even as time passes, nothing truly precious is ever lost. Thank you for listening, and may you find your own light in the little things, just as Cooper did. As Cooper's journey unfolded, two moments stood out as turning points. The first was when he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of golden turmeric milk Mary had placed before him. It wasn't just a drink, it was a choice, a simple act of saying, "I will fight for my mind." That small habit became a thread of hope, weaving itself into his days and reminding him that he was not powerless. The second transformation came later, when he found his voice again at the dinner table. After weeks of silence and hesitation, Cooper finally called his granddaughter by name without faltering. The smile that spread across his face and the tears that filled Mary's eyes proved that even in the fog of forgetting, moments of clarity can still shine through. It wasn't about curing the illness, but about reclaiming dignity. One word, one story, one memory at a time. Cooper's life reminds us that we cannot always control what time takes from us, but we can choose how we live within its passage. The food we prepare, the walks we take, the rest we allow ourselves, and the love we share, these are not small things. They are the foundation upon which memory is built and preserved. So as you reflect on his story, I invite you to look at your own days. Perhaps tonight, add a little rosemary to your meal, or tomorrow, take a gentle walk in the morning air. These are not just habits. They are investments in the moments you still wish to hold, the faces you never want to forget. And may you carry this truth with you. Even in the presence of loss, there is always room for hope, for love, and for life well lived.